The Atlantic at night is a geography of absence. No shoreline glow, no farmstead constellations. Only a black vault stitched with cold stars and a small cathedral of light inside a fighter cockpit. Captain John Miller rode the cathedral like a ritual, oxygen his steadying the mask, HUD symbols floating in militant green. Radar sweep ticking a metronome that calmed the animal part of the brain. 30,000 feet. Clean air, brutal temperature. The F-15 Eagle humming with restrained violence. On the UHF, the E-3A wax carried the voice of command across the dark. A smooth controller out of a floating city of antennas. Eagle 2, contact confirmed. Bearing 090, Angels 30. Speed is standby variable. Proceed to intercept. Variable, not a word air controllers like to say. Variable meant the numbers wouldn't sit still when you pinned them. It meant the ghost in the machine had hands. Miller nudged the throttle, felt the twin Pratt and Whitney engines answer. The Eagle's nose tracked the bearing with a surgeon's patience. He'd done this 100 times. Blip on scope, vector, visual ID. Usually a Soviet Tu-95 or a wandering civilian that had strayed into a chessboard where the pieces moved fast and penalties were steep. You kept your breathing slow, your thinking slower. The sky rewarded discipline. On the scope, the return jumped, steadied, then jump again, first a near hover, then a sprint off the ruler. The computer spat numbers that didn't belong in Earth's air. Mock changes that should have peeled paint and broken bones. Miller tuned the radar from RWS to TWS, squeezed a little anger out of the noise. The return sharpened into a hard diamond. AWACS, Eagle 2. Solid return. Attempting lock. Eagle 2, copy. Caution on ROE. State is observe only. Repeat, observe only. Observe only? You scrambled Eagles to intercept and escort, to challenge, to warn off. Observe was for long lenses and slow planes. He thumbed the cursor over the diamond and commanded a single target track. The lock tone sounded, one pure, descending note, and then died. The scope stuttered. For a heartbeat, the world inside the scope became a graveyard of static. Outside the canopy, nothing. The night ahead was a velvet sheet. He scanned the darkness with his eyes, then with the radar again. The return was now impossibly close and impossibly faint, like a star someone had drawn with a trembling hand. He glanced left and right, hunting for a navigation light, a beacon, a shimmer of exhaust. A light bloomed where none had been. Not white, not red, not the healthy green that belonged on wingtips. This was a blue-white pulse, texture like a living thing, ion sheen, aurora residue, something he felt in his teeth more than saw with his eyes. It swelled without approaching, as if distance and size had been rewritten into a private grammar. He felt the urge to talk just to prove his voice still worked. Eagle 2 has visual. Luminous object ahead. Range unknown. Movement irregular. The radio carried only carrier wave for a count of 5. When the controller returned, the voice had changed timbre, tighter, rehearsed. Eagle 2, maintain track. Do not. Repeat, do not attempt to illuminate with radar or weapons. Record everything. No plain language description on this net. Record everything with what? The Eagle recorded the radar and some parameters, sure, but the order felt bigger than the gear beneath his gloves. He considered the gun camera and killed the thought. He could feel in his bones that pointing anything at that light, even a camera, would be like touching a live wire. And then the universe performed a magic trick. The object moved from far to near with no in-between. One frame, it was a distant pulse across black infinity. The next, it was parked off his nose at a distance that made every nerve under his flight suit stand at attention. It had no wings, no tail, no intakes. A smooth, ovoid volume with edges that smoldered in soft luminescence, the way heated metal admits it's been working. Its surface was not polished and not dull. It was an answer to a question he didn't know how to phrase. Miller's hand, veteran steady in turbulence and war games and refueling at night, tightened on the stick. His other hand drifted toward the master arm as if old habit could write new rules. He caught himself and stopped. The HUD fluttered, digits shivered, crucials lost their manners. The radar broke lock and returned with a tone that didn't belong to any tech order he'd memorized. AWACS, Eagle 2, my systems. He didn't finish because finishing implied understanding. The first pulse came without warning. Not light in the Conan rod sense. Not sound, not pressure. All three at once and neither. The canopy seemed to bow inward like thick glass under ocean weight, and the air between his eyes and the HUD turned viscous, as if someone had poured invisible syrup into the cockpit. He flinched, and the motion lagged him by the barest fraction, a rawness proportional to the terror it triggered. Pictures arrived with a pulse. Not photographs, not movies. Impressions shaped like geometry. Spirals nested inside other spirals, a lattice of angles that made Euclid feel provincial. A horizon cracked open by 3 suns. A sea that fell upward. He sensed a tension, exactly the way you sense a gaze in a crowd when someone is watching you laugh. He tried to shout, discovered shouting was something mouths did in other realities. Here there was breathing and the press of the mask, and a heart teaching the ribs how to drum. The eagle held altitude like a monk holds silence, because discipline lived under the skin even when thoughts were on fire. The second pulse was softer and worse. It opened apart his mind where training ended and instinct lived. Someone or something touched the idea of him with the courtesy of a surgeon and the intimacy of a lover. No words passed, but an exchange happened in a language built of ratios, magnetism, angles to the sun, a measure of the Atlantic salt content in winter. He felt a question framed as an invitation. We can share coordinates if you'll share origins. He didn't consent. Consent felt assumed. Then absence. Not departure in any aeronautical sense. The object did not accelerate, did not bank, did not trail a signature. It existed and then it did not. In the plain way of thought does not exist after you forget it. The black ahead was boring again, honest and empty. The cockpit remembered how to be a cockpit. The HUD figure steadied. The radar woke a yawn of static and found nothing to claim. Warning lights that had glared like angry teachers went politely dark. The mask's rubber smell returned, ordinary and inconvenient. Eagle 2 status. The voice on the net pretended this had been an interval between commercials. Miller flexed his hands and discovered sweat inside the gloves despite the cold. Eagle 2 is green for flight. Contact lost. Object no factor. He kept his tone trimmed and military, ironing the tremor that wanted to be heard. Eagle 2, Roger. Return to base. Direct. Comms discipline from here. Marshall will meet you on recovery. Acknowledge. Eagle 2 copies. RTB direct. The Eagle turned for home on rails, so smooth they might have been laid by God. The stars stayed where stars belonged. The Atlantic below wore the expressionless face of something too large to notice you. On the way in, the body remembered its ordinary duties. He checked fuel, verified temps, ran the little rituals that made a flight like a rosary. Scan, cross-check, trust, and verify. None of it touched the thing that had happened. That lived behind the eyes now, where bright residue burned like afterimage. If he blinked, he could still see the lattice. Not a picture, but a habit the mind had acquired. Tower brought him down through the usual choreography. The runway materialized as twin lanes of sodium gold. The arresting cable waited like a belt across a waist. Touchdown was clean. The tire's brief scream wrote a signature on the night. On the taxiway, the world became procedural. A follow-me truck, flashing. A marshal in wands, precise and impersonal. He parked on a hard stand he'd parked on 100 times and shut the engines down by feel. The sudden quiet rolled in like weather. The canopy hinged open. November air climbed in raw and thin. He unlatched the mask and was surprised at the ordinary angles of his own face in the cockpit shadow. The crew chief climbed the ladder and looked up with professional concern that respected rank and airplane in equal proportions. "How's she feel, Captain?" Like a church bell after lightning, he almost said, "She's fine," he said instead. "Write up a radar gremlin. We'll sort it tomorrow." "Yes, sir." They wanted the film, of course. They wanted the cartridge from the recorder, even though some part of him suspected the cartridge had witnessed nothing it knew how to store. 2 men in uniforms with the right patches but without the right habits were waiting at the bottom of the ladder. Intelligence wore many faces, But there was a particular stillness to men who carried secrets the way other men carried sidearms. "Captain Miller," the taller one said, "not a question. With us, please." The room was beige and deliberate. Cement walls that had learned to keep confidences. A table that had hosted many versions of this conversation. A tape recorder already turning before anyone spoke. Its wheels a small lie about objectivity. Coffee in a paper cup that tasted like punishment. They asked the story in chronology, then reverse chronology, then instrumentation only, then feelings only, as if slicing the event at different angles would make it bleed out. Time of scramble, bearing in angels, radar mode, any attempt to illuminate with the radar after initial lock loss, any deviation from ROE. They asked him to draw what he saw. He surprised himself by drawing curves that suggested volume without edges. He kept wanting to add windows and rivets like a child correcting a fairy tale to make it believable. "Any physiological effects?" asked the shorter man, without looking up from a pad. "Define physiological," Miller said, and regretted the tone. "Headache? Nausea? Auditory phenomena?" "None that lasted." "That lasted walked into the air and sat down with them." "Any impressions you'd like to note?" the taller one said. The pause before impressions contained a thesis on what the Air Force did and did not admit into its reports. He tried to make words carry the weight of what had entered his head. It felt like being scanned. He hated the word as soon as he'd said it. Not the airplane. Me. Pens did not pause. They wrote this down with the same lack of drama they used to record the fuel state. Someone clicked the tape recorder off, flipped the cassette, clicked it on again. The tape rotated like time marching in place. They produced forms with boxes for altitude and vectors, and a box near the bottom that said NAR. No abnormal response. He stared at that box a long time, struck by the comedy. The taller man produced another paper that did not have boxes. It had a line for a signature and a paragraph that had been hammered so many times through so many generations of typewriters and printers that it felt like scripture. By signing, he acknowledged that this event, the specifics of this event, and any derivative reflections on this event were classified under laws that promised a life of consequences if he forgot how to keep quiet. He had signed versions of this before: planes, missions, weapons. Those had bound his profession. This one would bind himself. He signed anyway. Duty had habits, too. Outside, the base kept being a base. A crew rolled a tow bar under a wing. Somewhere a dog barked at nothing. A pilot taxied by and saluted a shadow. The night wore the face it wore before the sky had misbehaved. In the locker room, he sat alone on a bench and watched his hands remember how to unlace boots. He remembered the lattice and tried to forget the way it felt like an invitation. On a small metal shelf sat a locker note he'd left himself months ago, a grocery list and a life he vaguely recognized, coffee filters, lamp oil, a birthday card for a nephew he loved in the way men love children they don't know how to talk to. He took a pen and added 2 lines to the list he would never take to a store. Do not talk about the light. Do not let the light talk about you. The pen shook a little. He told himself it was the adrenaline unwinding. He told himself many reasonable things, until the reasonable things sounded like a lullaby sung by someone with a poor sense of pitch. When he finally stood, the bench made a sound like a quiet opinion. Outside, the wind came off the ocean with its own A to Z of salt and iron. He walked toward the parking lot and tried to leave the event in the hangar behind him, the way pilots left out behind airplanes. The night refused a trade. The lattice remained, gentler now, patient in the bone-deep way of tides and orbits. He understood suddenly and with offense that understanding did not matter. Far out over the same Atlantic he had just crossed, something existed that moved without obeying the treaties of lift and drag. It could enter a cockpit without opening a door. It could ask questions without owning a mouth. And it could disappear without exertion. The way a thought becomes a secret when you decide to keep it. He put the key in the ignition of a car that had never failed to start and listened to the starter turn. The engine caught. The dashboard lit up in the honest colors of machines that belonged to men. He drove home through a base that slept with one eye open and imagined he could feel, even here, even now, the faintest echo of a pulse that had not troubled the air and had troubled everything else. The The first time John Miller touched the throttle of a jet trainer, he thought of his father's old truck. Same vibration in the bones. Same growl that meant power is waiting if you dare to use it. But a truck could only kick dust on back roads. The T-38 Talon he learned and screamed straight into the sky, and the sky did not forgive hesitation. That was the early 1970s. America was bleeding itself out in Southeast Asia, and the Air Force wanted new blood, ready for whatever came next. Miller was lean, methodical, born to Midwestern flatlands where the horizon taught boys about distance and patience. Flight school taught him about discipline beyond imagination, hours of stick and rudder precision, emergency procedures rehearsed until muscle remembered before nerves could panic. By the time he earned his wings, the Cold War was the weather of every day. Two superpowers staring at each other across oceans and continents, measuring strength not in battles fought, but in battles rehearsed. The USSR flew its lumbering bombers along the edges of NATO airspace, like a dare. The U.S. answered with interceptors launched at a minute's notice. The game was endless, repetitive, and deadly serious. Miller joined a squadron on the East Coast, tasked with standing alert against Soviet intrusions. His life became a calendar of readiness. Sleep near the phone, boots by the door, jet-fueled, and armed on the tarmac at all times. The scramble siren was a gospel bell. You didn't ask why. You just ran, strapped in, lit the burners, and climbed. Most nights the intruders were bears. 95 bombers, massive and patient, flying close enough to tickle radar lines. Miller would slide his eagle alongside, close enough to see the red stars painted on the fuselage, close enough to watch Soviet crewmen aim cameras back at him. They always waved. It was ritual more than war, but the ritual had teeth. A mistake could mean missiles. Through repetition, he became a creature of procedures. Checklist after checklist. Weapon systems tested. Radar sweeps drilled into habit. There was comfort in it. The illusion that every variable could be tamed. That was the Air Force's promise. Train enough, plan enough, and the sky would behave. But whispers always traveled faster than orders. In the officers' lounge, when bourbon loosened tongues, stories surfaced of things radar tracked but never explained. Blips too fast, too erratic, vanishing at will. Controllers called them anomalous returns. Pilots called them ghosts. Officially, they were dismissed as weather reflections or Soviet tricks. Unofficially, some men spoke of lights that paced their jets, of objects that accelerated beyond physics. Always denied, never forgotten. Miller filed those tales in the cabinet of rumors where they couldn't touch his flying. He trusted what he saw, what the instruments told him, and what the manuals dictated. Yet a part of him, the part that once lay on prairie grass staring at the Milky Way, wondered if the rumors weren't smoke from a larger fire. By the mid-'80s, he was seasoned, confident, and loyal. He had a wife, a daughter who thought the flight suit made him a superhero, and a squadron that respected his calm under pressure. To them, he was Steady Miller, the one who kept formation tight, who never spooked when radar screamed or when Soviet fighters shadowed too close. Then came that night over the Atlantic. After landing, the machinery of secrecy took over. He was ushered not to the debriefing room he knew, but to a smaller, windowless chamber where intelligence officers waited. Their questions carved the night into sterile fragments. Altitude, bearing, throttle setting, radar mode. They avoided words like object or craft. Instead, they said target, contact, phenomenon. They asked him to repeat himself until the event sounded less like truth and more like a story he was making up. They pushed diagrams across the table. They pressed for consistency, then accused him of too much consistency. He realized it wasn't about understanding what happened. It was about shaping what could be written. At the end, they slid a form across the table. The top half was familiar. Boxes for altitude, time, mission code. The bottom half was different. A long paragraph heavy with legal gravity. By signing, he acknowledged that the incident was classified above top secret, that discussing outside authorized channels would violate national security law. He signed. What else could he do? Still, a detail gnawed at him. During questioning, one officer had glanced at the other when Miller described the pulses of light. It was a small look, quickly buried. But Miller had spent years reading body language at Mach speeds. That glance said he's not the first. Later in the barracks, he lay awake listening to the hum of fluorescent lights. The official record would say radar malfunction. His own notes confiscated. His gun camera footage gone. The event had been swallowed whole by the system, digested into silence. But the memory remained. Not just the sight of the object, not just the failure of his instruments. The impressions burned into his mind. The lattice of symbols, the sense of being examined, haunted him in ways he couldn't articulate. It was more than seeing something impossible. It was being seen back. Days turned to weeks, weeks into months. He flew again, intercepted bombers, drilled with NATO allies. To everyone else, he was still Captain Miller, dependable as ever. Inside, he carried a secret weight that distorted everything. His family noticed the distance in his eyes. His daughter asked if he was sick. His wife pressed him for answers he couldn't give. The Air Force didn't ask him to lie. It asked him to omit. Reports omitted. Debriefings omitted. Conversations omitted. And omission, repeated long enough, became a habit that ate at truth itself. One winter night, after another routine scramble, Miller sat in his quarters staring at a blank notebook. He wanted to record what he had seen, to keep it alive against the tide of denial. But every time the pen touched paper, he froze. The memory was too large, too strange, and the rules wrapped around his wrists like chains. He closed the notebook and shoved it into a drawer. He told himself the incident was over. A single night buried by paperwork. The world would keep turning. But he knew better. Something in the sky had written its presence into him, and no ink on any form could erase it. The Air Force had many ways of teaching obedience. Some were loud, drill instructors barking on a parade ground, klaxons jolting pilots awake for scrambles. Others were quieter, subtler, built into paperwork and procedure. But the most effective was silence, a silence so heavy it rewrote memory. After the incident, John Miller was pulled deeper into that silence. It began with another summons, not to the familiar intelligence wing on base, but to a facility off the map, a squat concrete building tucked into pine forest. No sign on the gate, just guards who didn't smile. His orders didn't list a location. They simply said report at 0700. Transportation provided. The ride was in a van with blacked-out windows. Two men in plain uniform sat across from him, their faces the kind you forget as soon as you look away. The only sound was the hum of tires. Miller kept his eyes on the floor, trying not to imagine where he was going. Inside the facility, the air smelled recycled, processed through too many filters. Corridors were narrow, painted in institutional green. He was led to a room with no windows, one table, and a reel-to-reel recorder already spinning. The questioning started clinical. Flight time, altitude, vector. Then it drifted. Describe the geometry again. One officer asked, voice flat. Miller sketched the ovoid shape, the glowing edges. The officer pushed for detail, angles, ratios, measurements Miller couldn't provide. When Miller admitted he didn't know, the man's pen tapped impatiently. Did you feel any physiological change? Another asked. Yes, Miller said cautiously. Like pressure inside my head. They exchanged glances. Not surprise, recognition. And the impressions? Miller hesitated. He wasn't supposed to speak about those. But the silence in the room demanded something. Patterns. Lattice work. Places I didn't recognize. Not dreams. More like transmissions. The officer leaned forward. Words. No. Just knowing. Images. They scribbled notes. The recorder whirred. When it ended, they handed him a new form, longer than the last, dense with citations of the Espionage Act, U.S. Code, military directives. By signing, he acknowledged criminal penalties for disclosure. Prison, ruined career. Worse, he signed. Back at his squadron, life pretended to be normal. Briefings about Soviet incursions. Maintenance checks. Flying patrols over the Atlantic. But the silence followed him. No one mentioned the incident. Not his CO, not the intelligence officers, not even his closest wingman. It was as if the night had been erased from the record, and yet Miller could feel something beneath the surface, an invisible machine grinding, compressing events into official narratives, reports rewritten, logs altered. He once glimpsed the entry for his mission in the squadron records. It read, routine patrol, radar malfunction, no anomalies. The lie was so small, so ordinary, it hurt more than denial. At night, he dreamed of the pulses. The first one slammed into him like surf. The second slid into his mind like a whisper. He would wake drenched in sweat, convinced he still saw the lattice burning behind his eyelids. He tried to talk to his wife. "Do you ever feel like something is watching us?" he asked once, over dinner. She frowned. "What do you mean?" "Like, bigger than people, bigger than countries." She laughed nervously. "John, you've been working too hard." He shut his mouth. She didn't need his burden. Weeks later, he was called again. Another debriefing, different faces. They asked the same questions, as if consistency was a test. This time they showed him photographs, grainy black and white frames of glowing shapes in the sky. "Do these resemble what you saw?" "Yes," he admitted, "but clearer." They nodded as though confirming their own archive. Then they slid the photos back into a folder stamped with a classification he had never seen before. It dawned on him. His encounter was an anomaly. It was part of a pattern, a file cabinet already thick with cases like his. The silence wasn't ignorance. It was policy. One officer finally leaned in. "Captain Miller, do you understand your role here?" Miller kept his voice even. "To defend the United States." "Correct. And sometimes defense requires discretion. National security depends not just on what we fight, but what the public believes we fight." The implication was clear. The public couldn't know. Not about lights that outran physics. Not about pulses that touched the mind. Miller left the facility with a new layer of silence. He carried it like armor, but inside, cracks had begun to form. He knew now that the government had a vocabulary for what he saw. He had glimpsed their photographs, their files, their system of erasure. He also knew something else. Once the lattice had touched him, it couldn't be untaught. It lived behind his eyes, patient and relentless, no matter how many forms he signed. For the first time in his career, John Miller began to doubt not his country, but the story his country told. John Miller kept flying. On paper, nothing had changed. His logbook filled with hours, patrols, intercept drills, joint exercises with NATO allies. His squadron still trusted him, still called him the steady hand. He wore the uniform, saluted the flag, ran checklists with the precision of a man who believed in order. But inside, order was cracking. The nightmares started subtle. At first, they were just reruns of the intercept. The radar, the sudden light, the systems failing. Then the dreams deepened. He was back in the cockpit, but the canopy dissolved and the night poured in. The lattice shimmered across the sky like scaffolding for a world that didn't belong to Earth. He woke drenched, chest heaving, a scream lodged behind his teeth. His wife noticed. She asked why he tossed in his sleep, why he stared too long at the horizon when they walked near the beach. He gave her evasions, stress, fatigue, long hours. She didn't press at first, but as the weeks bled into months, the distance between them thickened. Conversations shortened. Meals turned silent. His daughter, barely 9, tugged his sleeve once and whispered, "Daddy, are you sick?" He kissed her hair and said no. He wasn't sure it was true. The Air Force didn't help. The debriefings didn't stop. Every few weeks he was summoned again, different officers, same questions. Sometimes they asked him to repeat details until his memory blurred, as if they wanted him confused. Sometimes they pressed him to confirm technical impossibilities as errors in perception. One officer suggested maybe he'd suffered hypoxia at altitude. Miller almost laughed. He'd flown thousands of hours. He knew the taste of oxygen starvation. This was different. After each session, he signed new forms. The words blurred together. National security, unauthorized disclosure, penalties under federal law. The weight of silence grew heavier with every signature. And then came the watchers. It began with small things. A car he didn't recognize idling across the street from his house 2 nights in a row. A man in civilian clothes reading a newspaper outside the base gate, who folded at the moment Miller passed. At first he dismissed it as paranoia, but the pattern persisted. One evening, while leaving the commissary with groceries, 2 men in suits approached. Their smiles were polite, but their eyes carried the same stillness he'd seen in the interrogation rooms. "Captain Miller," one said smoothly, "we just wanted to remind you how important your service is. The country depends on loyal men like you." Miller nodded, unsure what to say. The second man leaned slightly closer. "And loyalty means discipline. Silence, too. You understand." It wasn't a threat. It was worse. It was a reminder, delivered like a priest reciting scripture. Then they left, as casually as if they'd asked about the weather. That night, Miller couldn't eat. He stared at the kitchen wall, while his wife tried to draw him into conversation. Finally she snapped, "John, you're here, but you're not. What's happening to you?" He opened his mouth, closed it again. He saw the lattice in his mind, glowing behind her face. How could he tell her? How could he drag her into the silence machine that owned him? "I can't," he said finally. She pushed back from the table, her chair scraping the floor. "Then I don't know how much longer I can do this." The word struck harder than any interrogation. Days later, during a flight, Miller caught himself hesitating. The ego responded as always, but his mind lagged, distracted by memories of the pulses. For the first time in his career, he felt doubt in the cockpit. Doubt was poison. He compensated with routine. Extra checks. Triple verification of instruments. Outwardly, he was still the reliable Captain Miller. Inwardly, the silence was consuming him. One night, unable to sleep, he dug out the notebook he'd hidden months earlier. He forced himself to write. The pen scratched shaky lines across the paper. Descriptions of light, the collapse of instruments, the impressions etched into his head. But when he tried to draw the lattice, his hand shook so badly the shapes blurred into nonsense. He tore the page out, crumpled it, and burned it in an ashtray. The next morning, he found the ashes scattered on the floor, though he was certain he had emptied the tray before bed. It unsettled him more than he admitted. The watchers kept appearing, always polite, always silent, always present just long enough for him to notice. The message was clear. We see you, even when you don't see us. The cost of silence wasn't just secrecy. It was erosion of trust, of marriage, of self. Miller carried himself like an officer, but at night, staring into the dark, he wondered if he was becoming less man and more ghost. He had defended his country against Soviet bombers, obeyed every order, flown through storms and near collisions. None of it had shaken him. But one encounter in the sky, an object that shouldn't exist, a pulse that entered his mind, had cracked the foundation of his life. And every day since, the silence machine ground the crack wider. The squadron bar was half-lit, a cavern of cigarette smoke and tired laughter. Pilots gathered there after sorties to bleed adrenaline into whiskey, to replay maneuvers in the air with gestures of hands, to brag and lie in equal measure. For years, John Miller had been part of that ritual. It was where camaraderie lived, where trust grew thick as jet fuel. But after the encounter, the bar felt different. The laughter was tinny, the story shallow. He sat at a corner table with a beer that went warm untouched, watching faces that looked younger every day. Men who hadn't yet seen the sky betray them. Across the room, a voice called, "Miller, you're drinking like a widower." It was Major Frank Dalton, a veteran with 20 years in cockpits, salt and pepper hair, and the calm eyes of a man who had seen enough to know when not to talk. Miller managed to smile. "Long week." Dalton slid into the chair opposite. "They're all long, some longer than others." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then Dalton leaned forward. "You've had the debriefings, haven't you?" Miller stiffened. "Debriefings?" Dalton's gaze didn't waver. The kind with no windows. The kind where they ask the same question until you doubt your own voice. Miller's throat went dry. He hadn't told anyone. Not his wife. Not his closest wingman. "What makes you say that?" Dalton took a sip of whiskey, set the glass down carefully. Because I've been there. Twice. The bar noise seemed to fade. Miller searched Dalton's face for any hint of mockery, but found only the heavy weight of recognition. What did you see? Miller asked. Dalton shook his head slowly. Doesn't matter. What matters is they don't want us talking about it. Ever. You sign the papers, you play dumb, you keep flying. That's the deal. Miller felt a cold rush through him. He had suspected others, but hearing it spoken aloud turned suspicion into fact. Why us? He asked quietly. Dalton's smile was bitter. Because we're the ones who get close enough to see. Radar operators catch blips. Civilians see lights. But we chase them. We look them in the eye. And that makes us dangerous. They sat in silence for a moment, the truth heavy between them. Then Dalton leaned in, voice lower. There's a file. Has to be. They keep records, photos, tapes, transcripts. I've seen glimpses. Classification, levels I didn't even know existed. One colonel called it Blue Book's ghost. Miller frowned. Project Blue Book was shut down in '69. Dalton smirked. Officially, you think they stopped looking after that? They just buried it deeper. The revelation tightened something in Miller's chest. His experience hadn't been isolated. It was part of a hidden archive, a catalog of encounters stripped from the public record, but alive in classified vaults. The silence wasn't just personal. It was systemic, engineered. Dalton's hand gripped his shoulder. Listen to me. You want to keep flying? Forget it happened. You want to keep your family safe? Forget it happened. Curiosity is a career killer. Sometimes more than that. Miller met his eyes. And you? Have you forgotten? Dalton's gaze wavered for the first time. No. I drink until I can't remember, then wake up remembering anyway. The conversation ended when younger pilots stumbled over, laughing too loud, eager to swap stories about maneuvers. Dalton rose, clapped Miller on the back, and left without another word. That night, Miller lay awake in his quarters, Dalton's words echoing. There's a file. Blue Book's ghost. He stared at the ceiling, imagining shelves of folders, reels of film, photographs of the impossible, all locked behind steel doors. His encounter wasn't an accident. There was a thread in a vast, hidden tapestry. The realization didn't ease his burden. It deepened it, because now he knew the silence wasn't just his. It belonged to all of them, a fraternity of witnesses bound not by loyalty, but by fear. And in the dark, with his eyes closed, the lattice returned, glowing, patient, insistent. No file could contain it. No officer could erase it. It lived inside him, waiting. On the flight line, Captain John Miller looked like any other pilot. Helmet tucked under his arm, flight suit pressed, visor polished to a mirror shine. He joked with the crew chief, saluted the ground marshal, and climbed a ladder into the cockpit with the grace of long habit. Engines lit, afterburners roared, and the Eagle carried him into the cold blue. To his squadron, he was still steady Miller, reliable, disciplined, unshakable. But that was only half the truth. The other half lived in shadows, in sleepless nights and silent arguments at home, in the lattice that bloomed behind his eyelids every time he closed them. He flew sorties by day and wrestled with visions by night. He spoke the language of procedure on base and the language of silence in his own house. His life had split clean down the middle, and he no longer knew which side of him was the imposter. His wife noticed before anyone else. She stopped asking what was wrong, because the question only widened the gulf between them. Instead, she spoke less, cooked alone, spent evenings reading with her daughter, while Miller sat in his study staring at blank paper. The silence at home mirrored the silence at work, and between the two, he felt himself vanishing. It was the child who broke him. One evening, she padded into his study in pajamas, clutching a stuffed rabbit. "Daddy," she whispered, "why don't you laugh anymore?" The question cut deeper than any interrogation. He pulled her into his lap, held her close, tried to smile. "I'll laugh again, sweetheart. I promise." But the words tasted like a lie. The nightmares persisted. The pulses returned in sleep, surging through him, filling his head with symbols he didn't understand. Sometimes he woke gasping, convinced the bedroom walls were dissolving into the lattice. He began drinking more at night, not to enjoy, but to blunt the edges. It dulled the dreams but never erased them. And then came the tapes. One night, after pacing the house until dawn, Miller retrieved an old cassette recorder from a closet. He loaded a tape-press record and spoke. His voice shook at first, but soon steadied. He described the flight in detail. Radar returns, the sudden light, the failure systems. He recounted the pulses, the impressions, the feeling of being seen back. He spoke into machine as if confessing to a priest. When he finished, he labeled the cassette with a date and locked it in a drawer. It was a small rebellion, a way to preserve truth against the erasure of official reports. If he couldn't tell his wife, if he couldn't write it down, at least he could speak it aloud to magnetic tape. One tape became 2. 2 became 10. Each night he recorded, his words tumbling out faster, as if racing against some invisible deadline. He described not only the encounter, but also the interrogations, the men who watched him, the sense of being followed. The tapes became his secret chronicle, a counterweight to the silence machine. But secrecy breeds paranoia. He began noticing footsteps behind him when he left the base late. Once, in the commissary parking lot, he found his car door unlocked, though he was sure he had locked it. Another time, he returned home to discover a kitchen drawer slightly ajar, as if someone had searched through it. His wife denied touching it. The watchers had returned, always polite, always distant, men at the edge of vision, disappearing when confronted. One even nodded to him once, as if acknowledging a shared secret. The fear gnawed at him, but beneath it something else stirred. Anger. Anger that he had risked his life in the sky, only to be treated like a liability. Anger that his family was collateral in a game of silence. Anger that truth itself was treated as a threat. At the squadron, the missions continued. Bombers intercept, tankers to rendezvous with, training sorties that painted the sky with contrails. He performed flawlessly, because performance was the only shield he had left. But every time he looked at the horizon, he wondered if the lattice was waiting just beyond it, patient and eternal. One evening, after a long patrol, Miller sat alone in his car outside his house. Inside, he could see his wife moving in the kitchen, his daughter coloring at the table. He wanted to go in to be the man they needed. Instead, he sat in the dark, gripping the wheel, whispering to himself, "You can't keep living 2 lives." But he didn't know which one to abandon. The winter wind swept across the base with a chill that gnawed through flight suits and leather gloves. But the cold wasn't what unsettled John Miller. It was the empty chair. Major Frank Dalton's locker stood open, a duffel bag gone, nameplate removed. No farewell, no orders posted on the board, no transfer announced at briefing. Pilots came and went all the time, but not like this. Not overnight, without paperwork, without a word. When Miller asked the CO about it, the colonel's reply was short-clipped, "Dalton's reassigned. Not your concern." His tone carried the weight of finality, the kind of voice that warned a man not to push. But Miller knew better. Dalton had spoken too plainly in the bar. He had hinted at files, at programs buried deeper than Blue Book. And now Dalton was gone, erased with the same efficiency that had swallowed Miller's own encounter. That night, Miller checked the drawers in his study 3 times. The cassette tapes were still there, stacked in neat rows, but he couldn't shake the feeling they'd been touched. A few were slightly out of order. He tried to convince himself it was his imagination, but paranoia gnawed at him like rust on steel. At the squadron, routine masked tension. Pilots laughed over cards, traded insults, planned weekends. But Miller noticed the shadows in their eyes, the pauses when conversations strayed too close to forbidden topics. A young lieutenant once muttered about strange returns on radar during a night sortie. The others hushed him instantly, the way men silence a drunk in church. It wasn't just silence anymore. It was fear thick and shared, unspoken but present in every glance. One afternoon, after a training flight, Miller was summoned to the operations building. Not unusual. Debriefs were standard. But the room waiting for him wasn't the familiar mission office. It was deeper in the building, colder, walls bare. 2 men in suits sat at the table. Not Air Force blues. Civilian suits, but their posture was military, sharp and predatory. "Captain Miller," one said, gesturing to the chair, "we need a few minutes of your time." He sat, massive composure on his face. The questions were soft at first. How was he sleeping? Any difficulties adjusting after long sorties? How was his family? Friendly concern dressed as inquiry. Then the tone shifted. "We understand you've been recording your thoughts," the second man said. Miller's blood froze. He kept his expression blank. "Recording? Notes. Reflections. Personal accounts." The man's eyes were steady, unblinking. "We'd advise against that. Memories can shift. Better to let the official record stand." Miller forced a neutral smile. "I keep flight logs. Everyone does." The first man leaned forward. "Not the kind we're talking about." The silence in the room stretched until the hum of the fluorescent lights became unbearable. Miller realized they knew. Maybe not everything, maybe not the number of tapes, but enough. The watchers had been inside his house. When they finally dismissed him, the words were polite, almost cordial. "We trust you'll make the right choice, Captain. You've served your country well. Don't let private habits complicate that service." He drove home that evening with his stomach in knots. The tapes waited in the drawer, but for the first time he couldn't bring himself to open it. If they wanted them, they could take them. Maybe they already had. That night he dreamed not of the lattice, but of silence itself. A silence so heavy it pressed against his ribs until he woke gasping for air. He sat up, drenched in sweat, and realized what Dalton must have understood before disappearing. The silence wasn't just a rule. It was a weapon, and now it was pointed at him. The base looked the same, rows of hangars, jets gleaming on the tarmac. The smell of fuel thick in the air. But to John Miller, it no longer felt like a place of duty. It felt like a stage where every move was watched, every line rehearsed. He lived inside the performance, wearing the mask of Captain Miller, reliable officer, obedient pilot. Beneath it, he counted shadows. He saw them everywhere. A man loitering near the post exchange, pretending to check his watch too often. A sedan parked across from his house, with fog windows, engine idling long after midnight. A telephone clicked that arrived a beat late when he answered. None of it was proof, but together it built a case his nerves couldn't dismiss. At home, even the walls felt compromised. His wife set dinner on the table and tried to speak of normal things. School projects, grocery lists, bills. But Miller's eyes wandered to the dark corners of the room, to the vents, to the phone on the wall. He answered questions too quickly, as if rehearsed or not at all. His wife began to stop trying. His daughter drew pictures of airplanes for him, leaving them on his desk. He wanted to tell her the truth, that the sky wasn't what she thought, but instead he forced a smile and said, "Beautiful sweetheart," before hiding the drawings away like contraband. The squadron carried on with its rituals. Briefings, check flights, poker games. Outwardly, nothing changed. Yet Miller began to notice pauses, glances exchanged between pilots when certain topics surfaced. Once, during a post-flight walk to the lockers, a younger pilot named Hayes fell into step beside him. "Sir," Hayes said softly, almost too soft for corridor, "did your radar ever draw shapes that don't make sense?" Miller's heart lurched. He kept his expression blank. Radars malfunctioned. Hayes hesitated, nodded too quickly, and veered off toward the showers. It was a question disguised as small talk, and Miller knew it for what it was, a feeler, a test. Hayes had seen something, or thought he had, and like Miller, he discovered the wall of silence that kept men isolated from each other. That night, Miller sat at his desk staring at the drawer where the cassette tapes were locked. 10 tapes now, each full of his voice whispering against the tide of erasure. He couldn't shake the image of strangers' hands rifling through them while he slept. His chest tightened at the thought of them being confiscated, or worse, used against him. He considered destroying them, but the idea filled him with panic. Without the tapes, the truth would vanish. The tapes were his proof, his anchor, yet keeping them at home was reckless. He thought of hiding them in a safety deposit box, or mailing them anonymously to someone he trusted. But who could he trust? Everyone he knew was either in uniform, under orders, or bound by the same silence. Sleep brought no relief. He woke one night, to footsteps outside his house. He crept to the window, heart hammering, and saw two silhouettes crossing the street. They didn't approach, didn't knock, just walked slow and deliberate, as if reminding him, "We are here." The next morning, his wife confronted him. "John, this can't go on. You don't eat, you barely sleep, you jump at shadows. I feel like I'm losing you." He wanted to tell her everything, to break the silence, but the words lodged in his throat, chained by signatures and threats. All he managed was, "It's work, classified." Her eyes filled with anger. "Work doesn't follow you home in the middle of the night." He said nothing. Silence had become his only defense. On base, during another sortie, Miller flew alongside Hayes in formation. Over the radio, Hayes's voice came, casual but laced with something heavier. "Funny thing, sir. Sometimes I think the sky is watching us, not the other way around." Miller's grip on the stick tightened. He didn't answer. Couldn't. But in that moment, he realized Hayes wasn't alone. None of them were. The silence wasn't designed to hide the truth from the pilots. It was designed to keep the pilots from finding each other. That night, back in his study, Miller unlocked the drawer and held one of the tapes in his hand. The plastic shell felt heavier than it should, weighted with all the nights he'd poured into it. He whispered to himself, "You don't belong here." For the first time, he considered what it might mean to hide them somewhere beyond the reach of the watchers, somewhere the silence machine couldn't follow. And the thought, dangerous as it was, brought him the first fragile taste of defiance. The drawer in Miller's study had become a shrine. Inside, the cassette tapes waited like artifacts, each one carrying his voice as fear as truth. Every night he touched them, shuffled them, considered where to take them. He thought of the bank downtown, safety deposit boxes behind steel doors. He thought of mailing them anonymously to his brother in Illinois. He thought of burying them in the woods behind the base, sealed in a metal box. But every scenario ended the same way. Eyes watching, footsteps following, doors opening in the dark. He couldn't escape the sense that the watchers already knew, that the tapes belonged not to him but to the silence machine. One Saturday evening, after his wife had taken their daughter to visit relatives, Miller sat alone at the kitchen table with a single tape in his hands. The plastic felt slick, as if it resisted his grip. He slid it into his pocket, stepped out into the night, and walked. The neighborhood was still, houses glowing warm with televisions and porch lights. But Miller felt exposed, like every window held someone staring. He turned corners at random, tried to shake the paranoia. Finally, he stopped beneath a street lamp, the tape heavy in his pocket. He whispered to himself, "Not tonight." He walked back home, defeated. The tape returned to the drawer. A few days later, a new mission broke the monotony. A training sortie over the Atlantic. Routine, nothing unusual. 2 eagles flying in formation, practicing intercept profiles. Miller strapped in, launched, and let the roar of the engines drown his restless thoughts. At altitude, the world was simple again. Sky, instruments, discipline. But halfway through the sortie, his radar twitched. A contact appeared, then vanished, then reappeared at impossible speed. Range uncertain, velocity jumping from near zero to Mach readings that made no sense. His wingman called out over the radio, "Eagle 2, you seeing that?" Miller's throat tightened. He forced calm into his voice. "Negative. Probably clutter." But the return lingered. A faint diamond, here and gone, as if teasing him. He scanned the horizon, eyes darting. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw a glow at the edge of vision, a pale shimmer, blue-white, like the memory of his first encounter. The lattice flared in his mind, unbidden. He gripped the stick, sweat forming under his gloves. His wingman's voice again, "Damn thing looks alive." "Maintain formation," Miller barked. His tone carried authority, but inside he felt hollow. The contact winked out for good. The scope cleared. The shimmer vanished. The sky returned to normal, a blank canvas. They completed the sortie without incident. On the ground, the debrief made no mention of anomalies. The log showed clean radar. No evidence. No proof. Miller didn't argue. He signed the forms, nodded, walked out, but the encounter gnawed at him. It wasn't just that the phenomenon had returned. It was that he wasn't sure whether it had happened at all. Was it real, or was it his mind replaying trauma? That night, he sat in the study with the tapes spread across the desk like playing cards. He turned them over, one by one, listening to the hollow rattle of reels inside. The lattice pulse in his thoughts, not as memory, but as presence. He realized, with a jolt of dread, that silence might not only protect him from the government, it might protect him from whatever lived inside that glow. If he kept speaking aloud, into tapes, into words, he might be inviting it back. For the first time, Miller considered destroying the archive. He struck a match, watched the flame crawl along the stick, held it above a cassette. The plastic warmed in his hand, but he couldn't drop it. He blew the match out, leaving only the smell of sulfur in the room. The tapes remained waiting, as patient as the sky. The house no longer felt like home. The kitchen table was a battlefield of silence. The bedroom, a cold expanse divided by unspoken truths. Miller's wife had stopped trying to reach him. She cooked for their daughter, folded laundry, kept routines alive, but between her and John stretched an invisible wall. One night, after dinner, she spoke without looking at him. "I can't keep doing this, John. You're here, but not here. You barely touch your food. You don't sleep. You don't talk. Our daughter asked me if you even love us anymore." The words landed like shrapnel. He wanted to tell her everything, to break the silence, to confess the sky had rewired him. But his oath, the watchers, the threats, they coiled around his throat. All he managed was, "It's not you. It's me. Work. Pressure." She pushed her plate away. "Work doesn't take your soul." That night, she slept in the guest room. Miller sat alone in his study. The tape spread across the desk. He pressed record on the latest cassette, his voice low, strained. Date, October 12th. Radar anomaly during training flight. Same signature. Same shimmer. If it was real, God, maybe it wasn't. Maybe it's me. Maybe I've lost a line. He stopped, rewound, replayed his own words until the sound of his voice felt like a stranger's. The next morning at the squadron, a Colonel Miller barely knew summoned him. The man's office was immaculate. Flags, medals, photographs of smiling pilots, shaking hands with generals. The colonel closed the door, leaned back in his chair, and studied Miller with unsettling calm. "You're a fine pilot, Captain. Your record speaks for itself. But lately there are concerns." Miller's stomach tightened. "Concerns, sir?" The colonel steepled his fingers. "Personal habits. Stress management. How you spend your time off duty." Miller forced his voice steady. "I follow regulations." A thin smile crossed the colonel's lips. "Regulations cover many things, but not everything. For example, private recordings." Miller's pulse spiked. He kept his expression flat, but sweat prickled his neck. "Recordings, sir?" The colonel didn't blink. "Memories are fragile. Better not to rely on them. Better to let official channels handle unusual experiences." The Air Force values discretion. The silence that followed was suffocating. Miller felt as though the walls themselves leaned closer. "Yes, sir," he said finally. The colonel nodded, satisfied. "Good man. Keep flying. Focus on the mission. Leave the rest to us." When Miller stepped out of the office, the corridor seemed longer, darker. He walked back to the squadron ready room with the certainty that the government not only knew about the tapes, they had probably listened to them. That night, his wife didn't come home. She left a note on the counter. "I need space. I'll stay with my sister for a while. Don't call until you're ready to be honest." Miller read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in the drawer with the tapes. It belonged there, with the other pieces of truth he couldn't share. For the first time in his career, John Miller doubted he would survive his service. Not from enemy fire, not from hostile skies, but from the slow erosion of silence grinding him down, piece by piece, until nothing remained. And still, when he closed his eyes, the lattice glowed, waiting, watching. The house was quiet now, too quiet. His daughter's laughter no longer echoed down the hallway, and the guest room remained occupied by the absence of his wife. John Miller lived among objects instead of people. Uniforms pressed and waiting, boots lined by the door, cassette tapes locked away in a drawer that had become his only confidant. The silence was supposed to bring relief, but it carried weight instead. It pressed on him at night, thicker than the dark, heavier than the dreams that woke him gasping. He had lost his family, without signing a single divorce paper. The silence machine had claimed them as effectively as any government order. At the squadron, he noticed whispers. Pilots spoke less when he entered a room. They traded glances too quickly, like men who'd read the same classified file but couldn't admit it. Rumors swirled quietly. A lieutenant reassigned after questioning a debrief too bluntly. A captain grounded for medical reasons after reporting strange lights on a night sortie. None of the men returned. Their lockers emptied overnight, their names scrubbed from rosters. Miller didn't need confirmation. He understood the pattern. The Air Force had a way of erasing men without killing them outright. Careers ended. Files sealed. Voices gone. Late one evening, as he walked across the nearly deserted base, he saw a figure waiting by his car. A man in civilian clothes, coat buttoned high, posture sharp. Miller slowed, every instinct screaming caution. Captain Miller, the man said evenly, not a question, a statement. Yes. The man held his gaze for a long moment. We wanted to remind you, loyalty is measured in more than sorties. It's measured in silence. Your country appreciates your discipline. The tone was polite, almost warm, but the message was cold iron. Before Miller could reply, the man walked away into the dark, leaving no name, no rank, no trace. That night, Miller sat at his desk with the tapes spread across the wood. 10, 12, maybe more. He'd lost count. Each one carried his voice, confessions whispered into plastic shells. They were dangerous. He knew if the Watchers had touched them once, they could do so again. If they wanted them destroyed, they could vanish as easily as Dalton had. And yet, he couldn't stop recording. The urge was no longer choice but compulsion. He loaded a fresh cassette, pressed record, and spoke. October 27th. Another visit. Not military. Civilian suit, though posture gave him away. They know. They always know. But I can't stop. These tapes are all that's left of me. If they erase this too, then I never existed. He paused, listening to the faint hiss of magnetic tape, swallowing his words. The sound steadied him, like a heartbeat outside his body. He leaned closer to the recorder. If anyone ever finds this, you'll know the truth wasn't lost. It was stolen. He clicked stop, ejected the cassette, and slid it into the drawer with the others. The collection grew, row after row of silent witnesses. Miller knew he was living on borrowed time. The Watchers would come again. Perhaps not tonight. Perhaps not tomorrow. But soon. Still, he recorded. Still, he resisted. Because in the growing void of his life, without his wife, without his daughter, the tapes had become the only proof he hadn't surrendered completely. The silence machine wanted his voice erased. The tapes were his refusal. The exercise was supposed to be routine. For eagles launched into cold air, their contrails stitching white scars across a hard winter sky. The mission profile was simple. Mock intercepts, radar drills, standard formation maneuvers. For John Miller, it was the kind of flight that usually offered a brief reprieve from the weight of ground life. Up here, surrounded by the roar of engines and the measured calm of checklists, he could almost believe he was still whole. Almost. At 25,000 feet, Miller's radar blinked. A return appeared at the edge of range. Small, fast, inconsistent. He frowned, adjusted the scope, and watched the contact dance. It leapt in speed, stopped dead, then leapt again. No aircraft behaved that way. Eagle lead, Eagle 2. Miller called on the radio. His voice clipped. Do you see that return? A pause. Then the lead's voice, calm but tight. Affirm. Stand by. Miller glanced out of the canopy. For a heartbeat, he saw it, just a shimmer, a distortion against the horizon, like heat haze in a sky too cold for mirages. A pale glow, blue-white, flickered once and vanished. Contact visual. Eagle 3 said quietly over the net. His tone was flat, controlled, but Miller could hear the edge beneath it. The flight continued. The intercept drills resumed. Nothing more was said about the anomaly. Back on the ground, in the ready room, the pilots filed their flight logs. Miller wrote his as instructed. Routine sortie, no anomalies. Across the table, Eagle 3 did the same. The others followed. Pen scratched paper in unison, neat lines of omission. When the logs were done, silence filled the room. The kind of silence heavier than any words. Each man had seen it. Each man had felt it. And each had chosen not to speak. Miller studied their faces. Young lieutenants with steady hands. Older captains with lined eyes. Not one of them looked surprised. Not one looked confused. They looked like men who had already learned the rules. See, don't say, no, don't admit. The unspoken pact bound them together more tightly than any mission. They were brothers not only in flight, but in silence. Later, in the locker room, Miller approached Eagle 3. Hayes, the same pilot who once hinted about radar shapes. Miller kept his voice low. You saw it. Hayes didn't look up from unlacing his boots. We all did. Then why? Because it never happened. Hayes's tone was final, his eyes hard. That's how we keep flying. Miller felt the words land like a blow. He wanted to argue, to shout, to tear down the wall of omission. But Hayes was right. The silence was survival. To speak was to vanish, like Dalton, like the others. That night, Miller recorded again. His voice on the cassette was taut, nearly breaking. December 3rd, exercise flight. Multiple witnesses. They all saw it. They all stayed silent. This isn't just me. This is systemic. A whole generation of pilots sworn to silence without ever signing a paper. Fear keeps them quiet. Fear and loyalty twisted together. He stopped the tape, stared at it spinning, and whispered, "And now I'm part of it, too." He clicked stop, slid the cassette into the drawer, and sat in the dark. The silence machine didn't need to threaten anymore. It had already won. It had taught them to police themselves, to deny their own eyes, to erase the sky from memory before pen touched paper. But as Miller closed the drawer, he knew one thing the silence machine could never erase. The truth still lived inside him. And every time he flew, every time the horizon stretched open, the truth waited, shimmering, just beyond reach. The night stretched longer than the days. John Miller lay awake in his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling until shadows blurred into shapes he half recognized. Sleep came in fragments, broken by sudden jolts, sweat cold on his skin. He would sit upright, fists clenched, sure he'd heard footsteps in the hallway, only to find the house empty. His body was betraying him. Hands that once gripped a stick steady at Mach speeds now trembled when he poured coffee. His eyes, sharp enough to read instruments at a glance, ached from squinting at shadows. Sometimes he lost track of simple things. A call sign in a briefing, the last page he'd read in a manual. He wrote notes to himself on scraps of paper, as if trying to prove his own continuity. At the base, the walls closed in. A readiness report he had signed came back corrected. With data changed, numbers altered, his signature looked genuine but not his. When he asked about it, the operations clerk shrugged. Must have been a clerical fix, sir. The smile was too smooth. In the ready room, he caught two younger pilots watching him a beat too long. Their conversation stopped when he entered. One looked down at his boots. The other smirked faintly, as if privy to a script Miller hadn't read. Paranoia whispered in his ear, "They know about the tapes. They've heard your voice in those reels. They're measuring how long until you break." On a training flight, his wingman called out a maneuver correction Miller hadn't needed. "You're drifting left, Eagle 2. But Miller's HUD showed perfect alignment. When he landed, the debrief notes listed minor deviation against his name. A small mark, trivial on paper, but he recognized the tactic. A drip of doubt, designed to wear him down. He clenched his jaw through it all, fighting the urge to shout. The silent machine thrived on fear, but now, fear was turning into something else. Anger. He felt it boiling beneath his skin, hotter each day. Anger at the watchers in their suits, at the colonels with their calm lies, at the system that treated loyal men like liabilities, anger at himself for obeying, for signing forms, for letting the tapes be his only act of rebellion. One evening, he sat in his study with cassettes spinning, his own voice whispering back to him from a week earlier. If they erased this too, then I never existed. The words stung. He slammed the stop button, yanked the tape out, and hurled it against the wall. The plastic cracked, real spilling brown ribbon across the floor like entrails. He stared at the wreckage, chest heaving, then dropped his knees to gather the pieces, as if he had injured a comrade. When he returned the shards to the drawer, he whispered, "No more fear." For the first time, he considered speaking aloud, not into a machine, not into secrecy, but as someone who could not be ignored. A journalist, a senator, anyone beyond the base. The thought terrified him, but it also lit a spark of defiance. That night, as he stared into the dark, the lattice returned, not as a vision forced upon him, but as a memory he summoned. Its glowing lines wove through his mind, steady, infinite. For the first time, it didn't feel like intrusion. It felt like witness. And in that moment, John Miller realized the silence machine could break his body, ruin his career, strip him of family and comrades. But it could not erase the truth burning inside him, not forever. The squadron cafeteria buzzed with idle chatter, trays clattering, the smell of reheated stew drifting through recycled air. Pilots joked about weather delays, cursed maintenance crews, traded bets on football scores. It was the kind of noise that usually shielded Miller from scrutiny. But today, he decided to test the edges of silence. He set his tray down beside Lieutenant Hayes, the young pilot who once dared a hint at strange radar shapes. Hayes glanced up, wary, then returned to stabbing at his potatoes. Miller kept his voice casual, low. "Funny thing about last week's exercise," he said. 4 radars can't all malfunction the same way." Hayes's fork froze midair. His eyes flicked toward Miller, then around the room. He lowered his voice to a whisper so faint Miller had to lean in. "Careful, sir." Then he stood abruptly, tray in hand, and walked out without finishing his meal. The message was clear. The pack still held. But the hesitation in Hayes's eyes told Miller something else. Others carried the same weight, even if they lacked the courage to name it. That night, Miller sat in his study with the tape spread across the desk like cards from a rigged deck. Dozens now, each containing hours of his voice whispering against erasure. They were both lifeline and liability. He imagined faceless men listening to them in some windowless room, cataloging every word, weighing whether he was a risk. The thought made his stomach twist. Destroying them felt unthinkable. Keeping them felt fatal. His anger, once private, began to leak into conversations. In the locker room, when a pilot complained about endless drills, Miller muttered, "Better drills than chasing ghosts no one admits exist." The words hung in the air. A sergeant nearby glanced up sharply, then looked away as if he hadn't heard. Later, during a briefing, the intelligence officer emphasized standard procedures for radar anomalies. Miller raised an eyebrow, asked evenly, "And what procedures cover non-standard anomalies?" The room went still. The officer's lips tightened. "That's outside the scope of this briefing." Afterward, a captain pulled him aside. "You're pushing it, Miller. Don't ask questions you don't want answered." But Miller did want answers. Needed them. The silence was no longer enough. A week later, he found something strange. A folder left on his desk in the ready room, thin, unmarked. Inside were photocopied pages, blurred radar graphs, handwritten notations, a date circled in red ink. The date matched his first encounter. No name, no explanation. Just data that confirmed what he'd lived. When he looked up, the room was empty. He never saw who left it. That night, he added a new tape. His voice was sharper, more urgent than before. "December 19th. Someone in the squadron knows. Left me records. Radar confirms what they erased from official logs. I'm not alone. Someone wants me to keep this alive." He stopped, stared at the recorder, and whispered, "But why me? Why now?" He ejected the tape, slid it into the drawer, and closed it with trembling hands. For the first time, Miller felt the silence machine wasn't perfectly sealed. There were cracks, and through those cracks something or someone was reaching back. The question that haunted him was no longer whether to act. It was how long until they moved against him if he did. The folder waited on his desk like a dare. Thin, ordinary, its corners frayed as though handled too many times. John Miller stared at it for a long time before touching it. Inside, photocopies, grainy radar plots, notations in an unfamiliar hand, and one date circled in red ink, the night of his first encounter. The graph showed exactly what he'd seen, a target accelerating, halting, vanishing, then reappearing. The official debrief had erased it, but here it was in black and white. Proof. He flipped through the pages, his pulse hammering. A few sheets bore stamps half-faded by the copier, classified, eyes only. Others looked like fragments torn from larger reports. One bore a name at the top, smudged but legible, Project Sentinel. Miller shut the folder quickly, scanning the room. Empty. The ready room smelled of coffee gone cold. Somewhere down the corridor, laughter echoed, pilots killing time before the next briefing. Whoever had left the folder hadn't wanted recognition. That night, in his study, he spread the pages across the desk beside his tapes. His hands shook as he traced the curves of the radar plots. Someone had broken the pact. Someone inside the system had risked leaving him this. But why? The next day, he tested the waters. During pre-flight checks, he asked the crew chief casually, "Ever notice logs not matching what actually happens?" The man's eyes flicked up, then quickly away. "Sir, I just fixed the jets." His tone carried a warning. "Don't drag me into this." Later, in the radar room, Miller lingered after a briefing. Screens hummed, operators bent over consoles. One young sergeant caught his eye, then glanced meaningfully at a locked cabinet near the wall. When Miller raised an eyebrow, the sergeant turned back to his console without a word. The message was subtle but clear. The file wasn't unique. There were more, locked away, hidden behind steel and clearance levels Miller would never touch. That evening, he recorded again, voice taut. January 4th, confirmed, logs altered. Someone inside knows, left me radar data. Project Sentinel. Must be the continuation of Blue Book. Pilots aren't crazy. Records exist. They've built an archive, buried it. Question is, why show me? He paused, staring at the recorder's reels turning. The silence in the room seemed alive, pressing against him. When he stopped the tape, he tucked it into the drawer with the others. The collection was growing, heavier by the week, but the folder didn't stay hidden long. 2 nights later, he returned to the ready room after hours. The folder was gone. Desk clear, as if it had never existed. Only a faint impression on the wood betrayed it had been there at all. Miller sat in the empty room, fists clenched. The watchers had taken it back, or someone else had decided he'd seen enough. Yet the damage was done. He knew the file existed. He knew Project Sentinel was real. And now he knew the silence machine wasn't perfect. But he also knew this. By looking too closely, he had crossed an invisible line. And lines in the Air Force were never crossed without consequence. The first sign was subtle. A canceled flight. No explanation, just a red line through his name on the sortie board. Rescheduled. The operations clerk said, but the look in the man's eyes suggested otherwise. The next day it happened again, another mission reassigned. By the third cancellation, Miller understood. They weren't grounding him, not openly. They were testing him, tightening the leash a notch at a time. In the ready room, the camaraderie had cooled. Conversations stopped when he walked in. Hayes, once a nervous ally, now avoided his gaze. Even the younger lieutenants looked at him as if he carried contagion. He could feel it in the air. They knew he had crossed a line. He was radioactive. At home, the silence deepened. The kitchen echoed with emptiness. His daughter's drawing still sat on the refrigerator, fading under the magnets, but his wife's presence had become a memory. He poured whiskey into a glass and stared at the telephone, tempted to call her, to beg her to come back. But what would he say? That the sky had burned him from the inside out? That men in suits rifled through his drawers while he slept? He walked to the study instead. The drawer opened with his familiar squeak, and for a moment he felt relief at the neat rows of cassettes inside. But then he counted. One was missing. Panic surged through him. He pulled the drawer completely out, dumped the tapes across the desk, checked under furniture, even in the wastebasket. Nothing. One cassette gone. He stood frozen, the room spinning. There had been no forced entry, no broken locks. Whoever had taken it had a key, or better, they had walked into his house, opened the drawer, chosen a tape, and left everything else in place. The message was unmistakable. We are inside your life. We own what you think is yours. Miller sank into his chair, heart hammering. For the first time, he felt true violation, not just of privacy, but of self. Those tapes were his confession, his rebellion, his only proof that the night in the sky had been real. Now one of them sat in someone else's hands, replayed in some sterile room, his voice dissected like evidence. He pressed record on a fresh cassette, his voice shaking. January 17th. They've been here. One tape missing. No break-in, no sign. Just gone. This isn't about Soviets. This isn't about keeping secrets from enemies. It's about keeping them from us, from the people we swore to protect. They don't care if I break. They care if I speak. He stopped, rewound, listened to his own ragged breath filling the room. Then he shoved the tape into the drawer with the others, though the act felt pointless. They could take them any time they wanted. The following morning, as he walked across the base, he felt eyes on him. Not just the usual watchers in plain clothes, but colleagues too. Pilots who once clapped his shoulder now offered curt nods, as if marking distance. One captain muttered, "Keep your head down, Miller," as they passed in the hallway. He understood then. The silence wasn't just enforced by the machine. It was enforced by everyone trapped inside it. And yet, as the day wore on, anger replaced fear. He thought of missing tape, of his wife's note, of the lattice still burning in his mind. The machine could strip his family, his career, even his sanity. But it could not erase what he'd seen with his own eyes. That truth, he realized, was the one thing still his. And if they wanted it buried, he would have to decide whether to bury it with himself or find a way to let it breathe. The drawer still held its rows of cassettes, but they no longer looked like a secret hoard. They looked like evidence waiting to be seized. Miller stared at them late into the night, the thought burrowing deeper with every hour. They didn't just take one. They copied them all. The missing tape had been a signal, not a theft. Proof that every word he had spoken in the dark now lived in someone else's archive. Each confession, each whisper, each tremor of doubt, cataloged, dissected, stored under a classification stamp he'd never see. He imagined a faceless analyst rewinding his life, pressing stop, scribbling notes, pressing play again. The realization poisoned the act itself. Recording had once been rebellion. Now it felt like collaboration. Every time he pressed a red button, he wasn't just preserving truth. He was feeding the machine. Still, he couldn't stop. The sky called him back in its own way. Another sortie. Another night over the Atlantic. Miller strapped into the Eagle. Engines roaring, instruments alive. At altitude, his radar sweep lit up with a contact. Strange, erratic, sliding across range gates with impossible speed. His stomach tightened. He keyed the mic. AWACS. Eagle 2 has anomalous return. Grid 279er. A pause. Then the voice came back, unnervingly calm. Eagle 2, maintain present course and altitude. Do not pursue. Miller blinked. That wasn't protocol. Standard intercepts call for investigation. Vectoring closer, visual confirmation. Say again, AWACS. Bearing 279er, possible unknown. Negative. Maintain course. Repeat, maintain. No deviation. The command wasn't caution. It was choreography. Miller's radar showed the contact growing stronger. He wanted to break formation, to chase, to do what instinct demanded. But the voice from AWACS repeated, Eagle 2, hold course. This is direct. He obeyed, jaw clenched, hands sweating inside his gloves. Out of the corner of his eye, he thought he saw it. A shimmer in the dark, a blue-white glow pacing him. Not distant this time, but close, watching. The lattice bloomed behind his eyes. lines of impossible geometry burning like a brand. His breath caught. He gripped the stick tighter, but didn't move. He realized then, they knew. The command, the calm denial, the silence. It wasn't ignorance. They knew what was out there. They were letting it happen. No, not letting. Guiding. The horrible thought struck. I'm not just a witness. I'm bait. They wanted him up here, in this jet, at this altitude, on this night. They wanted the thing to come close, to touch him again. He was a lure dangling on the end of a military line, drawing something in so it could be measured, recorded, studied. His chest burned with fury. He wasn't a pilot anymore. He was a specimen. The glow faded. The radar cleared. The AWACS voice returned, calm as ever. Eagle 2, anomaly resolved. Resume pattern. Resolved. A live package is procedure. When Miller landed, the debrief was perfunctory. No questions about anomalies. No notes about contacts. Just a form to sign. Routine flight. No incidents. He scrawled his name and shoved the paper back. That night, he sat in his study with a fresh cassette. He pressed record, voice tight with rage. January 28th. They're using me. They know the objects come. They hold me in place. Feed me to the sky like bait. Not defense. Not security. Experiment. I am their lure. And if that's true, then Dalton, Hayes, maybe all of us, are part of the same trap. He stopped, stared at the tape spinning, then shut off abruptly. The silence was worse than the recording. It pressed against him like the weight of the ocean. For the first time, Miller wondered if the true enemy wasn't above him in the sky, but behind him on the ground. The notice came folded in his mailbox on base. Mandatory medical evaluation, 0900 hours. No reason given. No signature. Just orders. Miller had been through plenty of checkups before. Flight physicals, vision tests, routine exams to keep pilots certified. But this felt different from the start. The clinic was too quiet. The receptionist's smile was too rehearsed. Even the fluorescent lights hummed too steadily, as if tuned. The doctor wore a white coat, but moved like a man who had once worn a uniform. He asked questions Miller had never heard in a flight physical. Any lapses of concentration? Any disturbances of sleep? Episodes of unusual perception? Miller kept his answers clipped, no more than any pilot. The doctor's pen scratched on the form, leaving trails Miller couldn't read from across the desk. Then came the memory tests. Word recall, pattern recognition, simple arithmetic delivered in a tone that implied traps. Miller performed flawlessly, but the doctor's nod was noncommittal, as if results mattered less than demeanor. When it ended, Miller signed nothing. The doctor simply said, "You'll be informed of the outcome," and dismissed him. Back at the squadron, the air felt thicker. Pilots milled around, but conversations hushed when Miller passed. Hayes wouldn't meet his eyes at all. In the locker room, he found an envelope slipped into his jacket pocket. Inside, a single sheet of paper with 6 words typed neatly in courier font. They are building your dossier now. No signature, no hint of who had slipped it there. But the truth hit like a punch. The watchers weren't just circling. They were preparing to ground him. Declaring him medically unfit would be the cleanest way. No scandal, no questions. Just one more pilot retired early, paperwork neat and sealed. That night, Miller rifled through his personal records. His most recent evaluation forms were missing. Flight surgeon reports had gaps, pages replaced with photocopies bearing faint differences. Someone was curating his file. He sat at his desk with the tapes piled around him like sandbags. The missing cassette, the copied voices, the stage anomalies, and now this. Piece by piece, they were writing him out his own life. He pressed record. February 3rd. They've started the medical angle. Questions about sleep, about concentration. They want me on paper as unfit. Once they put that stamp on my file, I'm finished. No cockpit, no credibility. They'll say everything I saw was stress, fatigue, delusion. And the worst part? It will work. The system is designed to make truth look like madness. He paused, swallowing hard, the tape hissing. If this is found after I'm gone, know this. The file isn't about my health. It's about control. They erased a man to erase the story. He stopped the tape, slid it into the drawer, then sat staring at the neat stack of cassettes. For the first time, he considered that he might not have the luxury of time. If they declared him unfit, his voice would vanish into the silence machine. The choice loomed: bury the truth with himself, or force into the light before they sealed his name in a folder marked incompetent. The warning came not in an envelope this time, but in a whisper. A medic Miller barely knew stopped him in the hallway outside the clinic, eyes darting to be sure they were alone. "Sir," the medic muttered, voice low, "your file's moving upstairs." Miller froze. Upstairs where? The man didn't answer, just walked on, white coat swaying, leaving Miller rooted in place with the words echoing in his head. Moving upstairs. In the Air Force, that meant headquarters. It meant review boards. It meant decisions made in rooms he'd never enter. That night, Miller went through his papers again. The photocopied medical forms, the missing evaluations. He spread them across his desk like fragments of a body dismembered on purpose. The pattern was clear. They weren't just gathering evidence. They were writing his ending. The next morning, he was assigned to a short training sortie. Routine, altitude hold, intercept pattern, nothing extraordinary. He strapped in, launched, climbed into cold clarity. For a while, it felt almost normal, the eagle steady, the sky clean. Then the shimmer came. Faint at first, just a distortion, on the edge of vision. Then a glow, soft, pulsing, blue-white. Not a craft, not a shape, just presence. He felt it more than saw it. His radar showed nothing, but the air around him tightened, as if reality itself were bending. He whispered into the mic without meaning to, "It's back." No one answered. The glow didn't close in this time. It paced him, patient like a predator studying prey. Miller's breath came fast, fogging his mask. And then, without warning, it wasn't outside anymore. It was inside. The lattice flare behind his eyes, more vivid than ever. Not just geometry now, but sensation. Heat, weight, a press of thought against thought. He felt himself unravel, pulled open like pages in a book someone else was reading. For a split second, he couldn't tell where he ended and it began. And then it was gone. The sky empty. The radar clean. The eagle alone. Miller's hand shook on the stick. He forced the jet back to base. Every movement mechanical, hollow. In the debrief, no one mentioned anomalies. The forms listed nothing unusual. Another routine flight. Another blank page for the archive. Back in his study, Miller loaded a fresh cassette, pressed record, and spoke through clenched teeth. February 14th. Contact again. Not just visual. Inside. They touched my mind again. It's stronger now, closer. I can't fight it. And the worst part? The Air Force isn't trying to stop it. They're feeding me to it. They're letting it happen while they build a file that says I'm unfit. They'll call it stress, delusion, anything but the truth. He stopped, stared at the spinning reels. His voice sounded alien to him, strained and cracked. He ejected the tape, slid it into the drawer with trembling hands, then leaned back in his chair. The silence pressed down like a verdict. For the first time, Miller wasn't sure if the Watchers wanted to erase him, or if the thing in the sky wanted to finish what had started. The letter wore its authority, like a press uniform. Heavy paper, embossed crest, the clipped dignity of headquarters. It waited on Miller's pillow when he came home. No envelope, just placed there, as if the bed itself were a desk in some orderly office. The heading read notice of comprehensive psychiatric evaluation. The phrases underneath were precise. Mandatory. Fit for duty determination, in accordance with failure to appear result in administrative action. It named a date, a time, a building with no windows, and an elevator that always smelled faintly of coolant. He held the letter a long time before sitting down. The mattress sighed. Outside, the coastal wind raked the pines and found every seam in the house. He folded the paper once, twice, then smoothed it flat again, as if it could iron meaning out of it. The evaluation wasn't a surprise. It was a culmination. Still, seeing it written, seeing the bureaucracy's handwriting on the future, turned the abstraction into a sentence. On the kitchen counter, The phone stared at him like an accusation. He picked it up, dialed 2 numbers, then set it down. The last note from his wife, "Don't call until you're ready to be honest," was still taped to the inside of a cabinet. He opened it and closed it and opened again, as if repetition could conjure courage. Honesty had become a luxury he couldn't afford in any currency the Air Force recognized. He went to the study instead. The drawer squeaked the note it always did, a familiar complaint. The cassettes gleamed under lamplight like a city of black stones. He took one at random and rolled it in his palm. The missing tape had taught him the arithmetic. Whatever he recorded, they recorded, too. A copy lived somewhere else. His voice had become a chorus in rooms he would never enter. He put the tape back and closed the drawer carefully, as if softness could guard it. He had nothing soft left to give. The next morning, the base wore its weekday face. Salutes at predictable intervals, the aromatic blend of jet fuel and coffee, a runway horizon trembling in heat, even when the air was cold. Miller walked the corridor to operations with a notice folded lengthwise in his pocket. He meant to keep his head down, to be the quiet version of himself that didn't peak systems. A man in a low-ranking intel badge intercepted him by the water fountain. "Captain," the man said, not quite meeting his eyes. Average height, average face, the kind of human camouflage the intelligence community favored. He offered a paper cup of water, as if it were a sacrament. "You have a minute?" In a supply closet that smelled of cardboard and lemon polish, the man spoke without preface. "It's not just you. There are dozens of files. Pilots, crew chiefs, controllers. The same pattern, anomalies, then debriefs, then evaluations." He glanced at the door, lowered his voice further. "They call it hygiene. Clean the line. Scrub the record. I thought you should know." Miller's pulse resumed its now familiar drum. "Why tell me?" "Because I'm tired of watching men get erased." A short laugh died in the man's throat. "Because my brother flew Phantoms, and he used to talk in his sleep. Because I can't sleep either." He slid a slip of paper across a shelf. 3 uppercase letters and a number. HSA 32. That's the archive code on the routing slips. If you ever hear it, you'll know which desk is chewing on you. Miller folded the slip into his palm with a care bordering on reverence. "What happens after the evaluation?" "Depends how cooperative you are," the man said. "If you're very cooperative, you get a desk. If you're mildly cooperative, you get leave you never asked for. If you're difficult, you get mercy, grounded on medical with benefits. Paper says anxiety disorder precipitated by occupational stress. Sometimes they add episodic dissociative phenomena. Sounds clinical. Costs less than truth." The word mercy landed like a slap. The man opened the closet door and let light back in. "I wasn't here," he said, and vanished into a hallway where everything looked properly labeled. Miller walked to the radar room because motion felt safer than stillness. Screens breathed green. Technicians breathed caffeine. The hum of electronics was a choir he'd learned to pray with. A sergeant looked up and then looked down again, sudden respect changing its expression to something else. Sorrow, maybe, or recognition of man already walking toward a door with only one handle. On the sortie board, his name had returned. A short training flight. Afternoon, good weather. It should have heartened him. It didn't. He saw the choreography now and could no longer mistake it for randomness. Flies were allowed their dance before the web closed. He flew, because fly was the last honest thing left. The eagle rose like a letter of protest sent to an indifferent sky. At altitude, the world simplified became its clean mathematics: airspeed, altitude, attitude. Numbers did not lie, even when people did. The horizon drew a line the mind could balance on. Halfway through the pattern, AWACS came across the frequency with a tone he could have sketched from memory. Eagle 2, maintain present course in Angels, say fuel state. Fuel state 7.2, Miller replied. Words like opening a locker you'd opened 10,000 times. The radar washed the darkness and found what it always found. Not much, then too much. A return winked to the edge of the scope, coy and shameless, a child and a god at once. Eagle 2, traffic advisory. AWACS continued, and then said nothing useful at all. The advisory rang like a bell. That meant only that bells existed. Miller kept his hands light on the stick. He did not chase. He would not offer himself so easily today. The shimmer paced him anyway. It was subtler now, as if it had learned his language and wanted to practice grammar. The lattice rose behind his eyes and did not press hard. It hovered like a question you could spend a lifetime answering. Back on the ground, they gave him a form to sign that translated his hour in the air into 12 lines. He signed because the habit was older than the hunger. He set the pen down with ceremony, as one sets down an implement after carving one's name into a tree he may never see again. In the locker room, the evaluation notice weighed down his pocket. He took it out, because not looking at it gave it more power than looking did. Hayes walked in, stopped, looked at the paper, then at Miller. "They're sending you," Hayes said softly. "They're sending me," Miller agreed. Hayes's eyes went to floor. "Sir, if they say you're unfit, you can appeal. It won't help, but you can." "Thank you," Miller said. "And men, I forgive you for surviving the way you were taught." That night, he did not drink. He wanted his thoughts as sharp as the edge he was walking. He laid the notice on the desk and placed a cassette on top of it, as one might place a stone on a grave. Then he opened the drawer and removed more tapes. He lined them on the desk in chronological rows. Voices sealed in plastic. Hours distilled into hiss and confession. Destroying them would be easy. Fire knows its business. But the idea tore something in him it could not mend. If he burned the tapes, he would solve a problem for men who had never once carried his fear for him. If he kept them here, he would deliver them the rest at their convenience. He thought of the bank downtown. Brick building. Tellers who wore smiles like hats. Vault that pretended to be simpler than it was. A safety deposit box was an answer with a key at both ends. The question was whether the other key wore a badge. He thought of the post office, of padded envelopes, of handwriting disguised as anyone's handwriting. He thought of a brother in Illinois who still kept baseball cards in plastic sleeves and believed institutions bent toward justice if you pushed hard enough. He thought of burying them. Earth is the only vault whose ledger no bureaucracy can easily audit. He pictured a waterproof box, a quiet stand of trees beyond the perimeter fence, coordinates he'd file in the drawer of his skull behind other coordinates nobody knew how to read. He chose all three because one plan felt like hope and three felt like a strategy. He worked by the discipline the Air Force had taught him and then feared he might apply. Labels, duplicates, lists. He recorded a new tape because the act itself had become the only honest ritual left. He pressed record and let the machine drink. "February 20th, he said, his voice steady for the first time in weeks. "Comprehensive psychiatric evaluation ordered. Translation. Final step. An Intel clerk confirmed the existence of multiple dossiers. Archive code HSA 32. If you're listening to this without me in the room, understand, this is not about flight safety. It is about narrative control. If the record calls me unfit, the record lies to protect itself." He paused, not to collect himself, but to allow anger to pass without spilling. When it was done, he continued, "I will not go quietly into a file drawer. I will leave the truth in 3 places. If one is found, the others will remain. If the archive copies my copies, then let them be the ones who fear duplication." He stopped, watched the real circle, felt something like mercy toward his own reflection in the dark window. He labeled the cassette with block letters that would not fade. Evaluation order. He made 2 copies. The hiss between words sounded like the ocean he grew up near and the radio static he had learned to love. He placed 1 copy into a small metal box he had bought for nails and never used for nails. He placed another into an envelope already addressed in an unfamiliar hand. The third he left where it belonged, among its siblings. At midnight he drove. The bank was closed to business, but open to the faithful. Late-night access for depositors who trusted systems at hours, when systems did not expect to be trusted. The vault received the box with bureaucratic solemnity. The clerk did not look at him, which was the same as kindness. He signed a ledger and left a name the ledger could spell, but not understand. At 1 a.m, he parked behind the post office and slid the envelope into a chute that did not ask questions. He listened for it to land among 1,000 other acts of faith. The sound it made might have been a question mark. At 2, he walked into the belt of trees past the chain link, where the base surrendered to civilian geography. A crescent moon lacquered the pine needles in nickel. He knelt, dug, placed a second box, covered it, erased his own footprints with pine boughs the way he'd once erased pencil mistakes with a pink eraser on math homework. He whispered the coordinates to himself twice and swallowed them. By 3 he was home. The house greeted him with the natural guilt houses have when they witness a man's furtive survival. He washed his hands and watched the water run clear, and then not at all, because his hands were clean and cleanliness had become a metaphor he had overused. He slept for 2 hours without dreams. The evaluation building did not pretend to be anything else. No signage. A door that locked behind you. With a click the spine obeyed. A reception desk altered to be neither welcoming nor hostile. The waiting room held magazines from months ago, laminated to offer the illusion of choice. He sat because sitting was the next box to check. They called his name, and he followed a nurse who had mastered the art of invisibility. The consulting room smelled of paper and something citrus. The psychiatrist in a suit that had never seen Hanger, Wire smiled with professional empathy. "Captain Miller," he said, "thank you for coming." As if he had been invited, they began with kindness and moved quickly to inventory. Sleep, appetite, concentration. Dreams, hallucinations, perceptual disturbances. He answered in the intervals truth aloud. When asked if he had ever felt external control of thought, he said, "In a cockpit, control is the only meaningful word." When asked if he had recorded his impressions, he said, "Pilots record everything." When asked if he trusted his chain of command, he said, "I trust airplanes." "Do you ever feel," the psychiatrist said, pen poised above a field on his form, "as if your experiences have been dismissed by those who should validate them?" "Yes," Miller said, and held the man's gaze until the pen moved and recorded something that would not save him. When it was over, the psychiatrist gave him a pamphlet about stress responses in high-demand occupations. The cover showed a smiling helicopter pilot whose eyes were too bright. "Captain," the psychiatrist said, standing, "this process exists to protect you." Miller said, "I built my life to protect others." They shook hands, because men like them always shake hands at thresholds. In the hallway, the nurse thanked him for his service, because the system has phrases it deploys to wash its hands between rooms. Outside, the air felt thinner than altitude. He walked his car through a parking lot that smelled of asphalt and quiet budgets. He sat behind the wheel and watched his breath fog the glass and thought about the 3 places his voice now lived. A vault, a mailbox, a hole in the earth. He felt no triumph. He felt only the steadiness that comes when a pilot has set his intentions on a runway nobody else can see. The sky above the base wore a pale winter blue, the kind of color that made you believe clarity was a promise and not a taunt. Far out over the Atlantic, he could almost sense a shimmer he would someday have to name again. His body ached to climb, to put metal into air and silence into engines, and rush into the only chapel he had ever trusted. The letter with the crest lay on the passenger seat. He refolded it, tucked it back into the jacket pocket, where pilots keep checklists and men keep last resorts. He turned the key. The engine caught. The dashboard lit. The day made room for him. There would be a result in a week or 2, or whenever the archive decided time should behave. There would be a code on a line that matched HSA 32, or another code that meant the same thing in a different dialect of control. There would be consequences carefully printed. He drove anyway, because motion was the one thing the silence machine could not confiscate while he was still inside his body. He counted traffic lights as if they were runways. He exhaled on digits he trusted. He did not look in the rearview mirror. In his pocket, the folded slip of paper warmed with his skin, the 3 letters and a number he could no longer unknow. On the seat, the evaluation, notice cooled in the presence of sun. In the ground beyond the fence, a small metal box learned the slow language of Earth. And somewhere in rooms without windows, his voice revolved through a recorder that belonged to someone else, a loop of magnetic truth the machine would label and file and pretend to own. He knew better. The envelope was waiting in his squadron mailbox, thin enough to seem harmless. Inside, A single sheet bore the verdict: fitness for duty under review. Temporary suspension of flight status. No outright grounding, no medical discharge, not yet. Just a limbo of bureaucracy, where men were left to wither while paper did the killing. Miller read it twice, then folded it carefully, as if mishandling it might make the word sharper. He slipped it into his pocket and walked the familiar halls of the operations building. For years, those halls had carried the cadence of his boots, the clipped rhythm of belonging. Today, the rhythm echoed hollow. He was still in uniform, but he no longer felt like a pilot. He was a ghost wandering through the machinery of the Air Force. In the ready room, chatter dulled when he entered. No one met his eyes. A captain cleared his throat and shifted conversation to football scores. Miller sat alone, listening to the laughter that used to include him. He realized that in this place, exile didn't require leaving. It only required silence. At home, the house pressed heavier than before. His wife's absence was now permanent. She hadn't called in weeks. His daughter's voice survived only in memory. The study, once a refuge, now felt like a morgue. The tapes lined up in the drawer like headstones, neat and final. He touched them one by one, as if counting the dead, but it was the copy at the bank that gnawed at him. The last time he checked, the clerk had smiled politely, ledger open, vault door heavy and certain. But now, he felt unease prickling at him. If they had been inside his house, why not inside the vault? He pictured men in suits signing forms with borrowed authority, sliding his box onto a table under fluorescent lights, spooling the tape with practiced fingers. One night, he drove to the bank after hours and sat across the street in his car, watching the dark windows. No sign of intrusion, no alarms, nothing unusual. Yet he couldn't shake the conviction that the vault had already been breached, that his voice was echoing even now in some sterile room far away. Back in his study, he pressed record again, his voice low, stripped of anger. March 2nd, suspended. They've clipped my wings without saying so outright. I can't fly. I can't speak. I can't even protect what I've hidden. The vault, the mail, the earth. I thought 3 plans meant safety. Now I think it means 3 places for them to follow me. Maybe the bank is already compromised. Maybe the envelope never reached Illinois. Maybe the soil will give up what I buried when the ground thaws. He paused, the hiss of tape filling the silence like static from a dead channel. I thought flying was what made me alive. Now grounded, I realized it was more than that. Fly was the only place I knew who I was. Without it, I'm already dead. He clicked stop, slid the cassette into the drawer, then shut it firmly, as if trying to contain a contagion. That night, lying in bed, he felt it again. Not a dream, not a memory, but a presence. The lattice bloomed behind his eyes, lines of impossible geometry threading through the dark. It didn't press this time. It beckoned. He whispered to the empty room, "You want me back in the sky." But the government had locked him to ground, caught between 2 powers, one human, one not. John Miller realized he was no longer a pilot in control of his own trajectory. He was a man suspended in midair, waiting to see which gravity would claim him first. He wore his dress blues because the uniform still knew how to hold a spine upright. Captain John Miller walked into the operations building and asked, politely, precisely, to be returned to flight status pending final determination. He presented hours, evaluations, clean sims. He offered procedure like a bouquet. Check ride, supervised hops, whatever the book required. The colonel, with a careful smile, said all the right phrases in all the wrong tones. Appreciate your initiative, Captain. We'll review. There are channels. The board convenes soon. Your request will be considered. Considered was a new word for forgotten. Miller tried the medical office next. The flight surgeon's receptionist checked a screen that might have been turned off and said, "Your file is in transit." In transit was a new word for nowhere. He asked to speak with the surgeon. Doctors unavailable. Unavailable was the new word for hiding. He returned to the squadron and stood at the window overlooking the flight line as a pair of eagles lit their burners and went sprinting into the cold blue, his religion performed by other men. He felt the vibration through the glass like a heartbeat. He could no longer claim. That evening he drove to the post office and asked about a registered item he'd sent weeks ago. He had the slip, the date, the destination, the ritual. The clerk with the stamp and the 1,000-yard patience tapped the terminal and frowned. "Delivered," she said. "Signed by whom?" The clerk read the name. It wasn't his brother's. It wasn't anyone he knew. "Agent," the clerk added, puzzled, as if reading an unfamiliar rank. "Signature on file." "Can I see it?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "Not without a request from the recipient," she said, and slid the screen away as if closing a curtain. He drove home with the radio off and the heater on high, trying to thaw a cold that had learned to live in bone. The house greeted him with its honest creaks. In the kitchen, he turned on the tap. The water ran, then shivered as though something had touched the pipes. He turned it off and listened. Old houses make old noises. He told himself this until belief sounded like a bad rehearsal. He sat in the study and didn't open the drawer. The cassettes would be there until they weren't. That was the law of objects under occupation. Instead, he set the recorder on the desk and pressed record without thinking. He spoke to the room as if he had already accepted that rooms listened. "March 9th, he said calmly. "Request to fly denied by time. File still traveling at the speed of bureaucracy. Post office confirms delivery. Signed by an agent who is not my brother. I am being what? Curated." He stopped, left the recorder running, and leaned back in the chair. He didn't rewind anymore. He didn't need to hear his own voice to believe it existed. In the hallway, a picture frame ticked against the wall, as if a small wind had passed. No windows were open. The refrigerator compressor came on, then off, then on again in a staccato that didn't belong to machines in working order. The overhead light dimmed and brightened, as if someone were testing voltage with gloved hands. He stood and the floorboard under his right heel answered with a long, slow groan he had never heard before. He held his breath and listened for footsteps that did not arrive. "Stop," he said to an empty house, and only then realized he had addressed a presence, not a malfunction. Silence expanded to fill meaning. He walked room to room. In the living room, the television blinked from sleep to life to snow and back, the screen a winter field without horizon. He reached for the remote. Before his thumb found the button, the set shut itself off and stayed off, obedient as a chastened dog. Back in the study, the recorder's reels turned. He hadn't spoken in minutes, but the tape carried a faint sizzle, a sound like distant rain, not the usual hiss. Layered under it, a pulse, regular, too clean to be random. He leaned close. The pulse slowed when he leaned. He stepped back. It quickened. He moved his hand above the machine and felt a prickle on his skin, the sensation of standing near a cathode ray tube on a winter day. When he put his hand flat on the desk, a hairline crack of static popped against his palm. He clicked stop. The pulse continued for a few seconds, as if the room itself were finishing a thought, then faded. He placed both palms on the desk and spoke to the wood. "I'm grounded. Is that what you wanted?" The lamp flickered once, an answer a man might accept if he had run out of other kinds. He did not sleep. He paced until the carpet learned the map of his worry. At 3 a.m, the kitchen radio, long unplugged, emitted a strand of static like a breath held and released. At 4, the bathroom mirror clouded over as if a shower had just ended. At 5, before dawn, when houses feel most honest and most haunted, he walked outside in a coat over a T-shirt and looked up. The sky was a hard lit of cloud lit faintly by the town sodium lamps. No stars, but he felt the itch behind the eyes, the lattice assembling itself absent light, the geometry flickering on nerves instead of retinas. It did not push. It waited, the patience of tides and archives. On the ground, then, he said, "You can come here, too." He went back inside, brewed coffee, didn't drink it. He put the cup down and found the recorder on again, reels turning. He had not touched it. He leaned in, pressed his ear close. Through the hiss and the new pulse he heard a thinner sound, like a far-off signal bouncing through layers of weather. Not words. Pattern, ratios, beats within beats, a metronome learning to dance. He clicked stop. The reels obeyed. The pulse did not. It lived in the air now. the way a tune lives in a room long after the band has gone outside to smoke. At noon, he put on his jacket and returned to base because men who have been taught to report keep reporting. He walked into the ops building and asked again to be scheduled for a check ride. The scheduling officer looked past him at a bulletin board that did not require attention. "Status is pending, Captain," the man said. "Your case is being managed." "By who?" "By the appropriate authorities." He might have laughed if he had remembered how. "If my case is being managed," he said, "perhaps my life could be informed." The officer blinked, heard the insubordination in the grammar, and wrote it down somewhere inside himself. On his way out, in the corridor where men passed each other with the choreography of shared purpose, Hayes fell into step beside him without looking at him. "They came to my house," Hayes said, voice a notch above silence. "I don't keep tapes." "They still came." "What did they take?" "Nothing. I think they were measuring the absence." They reached the door and separated without a gesture. That evening, the house took a breath and held it. The furnace shut off mid-cycle. The refrigerator stayed quiet. The clock over the stove stopped at 1947 and refused to be corrected, an instrument declaring its own sovereign time. He stood in the center of the living room and said, "All right." He went to the bedroom and pulled the mattress aside from the wall by 6 inches. The carpet underneath bore the dust ghost of where furniture used to live. He lay down on the bare floor and stared at the ceiling from a new angle. The lattice descended gently, not like a hand on a throat, but like a net in water. He did not resist. He wanted to know if it could hear men who were not airborne. His skin cooled. The air thickened, then thinned. The feeling was not unlike the moment before a stall, when the airplane talks to you through the stick with a language of warning. He listened past fear. In the place where training ended and instinct lived, a thought arrived that was not his and did not pretend to be. Return. A single word without vowels. A pressure translated by nerves. A vector without coordinates. Not a command. An invitation phrase as inevitability. "I can't," he said to the ceiling that didn't need to be the sky. "They've taken my wings." The word came again, not louder, but closer. Return. The lamp on the dresser glowed a little brighter, then dimmed to the level of a candle's patience. The clock on the stove in the other room clicked forward to 1948, and then back to 1947, as if reconsidering. He sat up, and the sensation retreated, like a tide that had been told politeness was required. In the study, the recorder clicked itself on, then off, then on again, as if testing whether rituals were still shared. He did what he had always done when the unmanageable demanded ceremony. He prepared a checklist. House power, stable/unstable, note events. Recorder behavior, autonomous start/stop documented. Appliance anomalies, TV, radio, clock times logged. Physiological, pulse, breath, temperature before/after presence. Language, if message repeats, transcribe rhythm. He wrote the list on a yellow pad with block letters a crew chief could read across a noisy hangar. He pinned it to the corkboard over the desk and felt for a moment like a man reclaiming inches in a fight measured in miles. Then he added a last line he hadn't intended to write. "If they keep me from the sky, I will bring the sky here." The week advanced in bureaucratic increments. He remained grounded. The bank manager called to say there had been an audit event in the vault and all boxes were verified intact. Would he like to schedule a time confirm? The tone attempted reassurance and landed on choreography. He made an appointment and knew what he would and would not be allowed to see. On Wednesday night, the presence returned without theatrics. The air hummed at the edge of hearing. He sat at the desk, pressed record, and said nothing. The tape captured the room's new heartbeat. The lattice settled over his shoulders like a shawl cut from starlight and numbers. The word did not come this time. He offered one instead. "Why me?" Silence answered with rigor. Then a shape of thought, like a map occurrence. Not a selection, a proximity. Whoever is there when the door opens becomes the one who knows it exists. He closed his eyes and felt tears do what they do without permission. Not because he was afraid, which he was, or because he was angry, which he would always be, but because the explanation was so ordinary it hurt. The secret chose the nearest witness. The machine on the ground chose the nearest liar. He opened his eyes. The lamp steadied. The refrigerator resumed its honest hum. The clock advanced to 1949 and had the decency to keep going. The recorder reel spun like little planets that believed in gravity. He clicked stop and did not rewind. Grounded, alone, watched by men and watched by something that could not be men, he understood the new terrain. He would not be permitted up into the air where the door had first opened. The door, therefore, had moved. Or perhaps it had never belonged to altitude in the first place. He stood in the threshold between hallway and study and tested the edge where one room became another. He felt nothing. He laughed. A small, dry sound that startled the house into creaking. He turned out the lights, and the dark did not frighten him. He lay on the floor again, now between the bed and the wall, an improvised runway, and he waited without prayer. The presence arrived with the punctuality of trains in a country that values schedules more than truth. Return, it said without words. Then give me wings they can't take, he said without sound. The air neither agreed nor argued. It held him the way a strong current holds a swimmer who has decided at last to stop, pretending there is land in every direction. The order came on a Friday morning, tucked in a brown envelope stamped with the insignia of headquarters. Miller opened at his kitchen table, the same place where his daughter once colored airplanes with crayons. The letter was short, bureaucratic, merciless. Captain John Miller is hereby placed on indefinite non-flight status, pending administrative review, effective immediately. No hearing, no appeal, just a signature at the bottom that belonged to a colonel who had never flown combat, never seen the sky break open in impossible ways. Miller sat for a long time, the paper trembling between his fingers. A pilot without flight status was like a priest excommunicated. The uniform still fit, the rank still gleamed, but the essence was gone. He had been hollowed out with ink. At the base, word spread quickly. Men who once sought his counsel now avoided eye contact. Hayes offered a curt nod, but nothing more. Even the crew chiefs looked through him, as if the suspension were contagious. By the end of the day, Miller realized he had already been written out of the squadron story. That night, the presence returned. It began with the recorder clicking on by itself. He had left it unplugged, certain this time it would stay silent. Yet the reels turned, hissing. Miller leaned close, and beneath the static he heard the pulse again. Slower, heavier, like a heartbeat dragged through water. Then the lights flickered, and the air grew dense. The lattice unfolded in his mind, brighter, sharper, its angles cutting deeper into thought. His pulse spiked. He gripped the desk as the geometry pressed closer, no longer content to hover. "Not now," he muttered. "I can't follow. They've taken my wings." The lattice flared, and for the first time he felt emotion in it. Not words, not images, but insistence. Return. He stumbled back, chest heaving. The presence wasn't just calling him upward. It was calling him outward, beyond cockpit, beyond altitude. It wanted a deeper contact, a surrender that frightened him more than death. He whispered through clenched teeth, "You don't understand. They've grounded me. They're watching me. If I try—" The lamp beside him burst with a sharp crack, glass scattering across the desk. The room fell into darkness, lit only by the faint glow of the recorder's reels. The pulse grew louder, a rhythm he felt in his ribs. Miller pressed his palms to his temples. "Stop." And then, just as suddenly, it did. The air cleared. The silence returned. The recorder clicked off. Only the smell of burnt filament lingered. Shaking, he dropped into the chair. He pulled one of the folders from his growing pile of stolen fragments. Photocopied graphs, notes, scraps of data that hinted at Project Sentinel. His eyes locked on a phrase he had missed before, scrawled in pencil at the bottom of a page. Subject Miller demonstrates anomalous resonance. His stomach turned cold. They knew. The government wasn't just monitoring him. They had identified the connection between him and the phenomenon. They were tracking it, measuring it, labeling it like a biological specimen. He grabbed a fresh cassette, shoved it into the recorder, and pressed record. His voice came out hoarse, raw. "March 17th. They've grounded me. My career's over. But the contact doesn't stop. It's stronger. It's here. They know it too. I found my name in the files. Anomalous resonance. That's what they call it. To them, I'm not a pilot, not even a man. I'm an experiment that keeps feeding them data. He stopped, staring at the reel spinning. His reflection in the window looked back at him, pale, hollow, unshaven. He hardly recognized a man in uniform. For the first time, he felt the terrifying possibility that his grounding wasn't punishment. It was preparation. And whatever they were preparing him for, he wasn't sure he wanted to survive it. The phrase followed him everywhere now, anomalous resonance. It had been scribbled in pencil on the margin of a photocopied page, but in Miller's mind it burned brighter than any stamped classification. It explained too much and nothing at all. He wasn't just a witness. He was a conduit. At night, the proof surrounded him. The presence no longer waited for him to climb into a cockpit or punch through clouds. It came into his home, into his bones. Lamps flickered in rhythm with his pulse. The refrigerator compressor throbbed in sync with the hiss of his breath. The recorder switched on without his hand, reels turning, capturing silence until silence itself began to sound alive. On March 24th, he woke to find every clock in the house stopped at 2:17. When he pressed play on the recorder, the tape revealed a low hum that hadn't been there before. Not words, not static. A tone, steady and layered, like chords struck on an organ whose keys were made of light. He stopped the tape, but the tone went on in his head. By day, the watchers grew bolder. A car he didn't recognize idled across the street for hours, engine running, windows dark. Once, when he stepped outside to fetch the mail, a man stood at the corner pretending to smoke, though the cigarette never burned. His neighbors, people he'd known for years, suddenly greeted him with smiles too wide, questions too sharp. "How's work, John?" "Still flying." They knew he wasn't. Their eyes said they knew more. One evening, a knock rattled the door. Two men in suits, identical ties, stood framed against the porch light. "Captain Miller," one said smoothly. "We've had reports of electrical disturbances in the area. Power surges, irregularities. You noticed anything unusual?" Miller stared at them, jaw clenched. "No." The man nodded, scribbled something in a small notebook. "If you do, please let us know. Could be a hazard." They left without waiting for questions. Their car rolled away silently, its headlights off until it reached the corner. Inside, Miller leaned against the doorframe, heart hammering. He walked into the study and opened the drawer. The tapes waited, lying like soldiers. He lifted one, turned it in his hand, pressed play. The hum filled the room instantly. Stronger this time, layered with pulses that made his chest vibrate. He shut it off, but the vibration stayed, humming in his ribs. He whispered to himself, "I'm not recording them. They're recording me." That night, lying in bed, the lattice returned, not distant, not subtle, but vivid, its glowing lines etched across the ceiling like constellations drawn by alien hands. It wasn't pressing him anymore. It was flowing through him, as if he were a wire in a circuit designed before men knew what circuits were. He sat up, breath shallow. The word came again, a pressure translated into thought. Return. He shook his head. "They won't let me." The lattice brightened, angles shifting, lines multiplying. His skin tingled, hair standing on end. The air smelled faintly of ozone, as if lightning had struck nearby. "You are the door," the pressure said. Not in English, not in sound, but in meaning. Miller pressed his hands to his face. The government thought he was dangerous because he saw. But the truth was worse. He wasn't just a witness. He was the bridge. Down the street, an engine idled. A man pretended to smoke. Two forces, one human and one not, closed around him. And John Miller understood, with a clarity that terrified him, that soon he would have to choose who he truly served. The silence machine on the ground or the impossible lattice in the sky. The order came at dawn, slid under his front door like an invitation to surrender. Captain John Miller is to report immediately for transfer to medical supervision at Walter Reed. All personal effects to be collected by authorized personnel. He sat at the table, the paper trembling in his hands. Outside, a car idled at the curb. Two silhouettes waited inside. The watchers no longer pretended. He went to the study. The drawer stood open. The tapes were gone. Every cassette, every confession, stripped from him in the night without breaking a lock. Only the faint smell of ozone lingered, sharp and metallic. He should have felt despair. Instead, he felt strangely relieved. The weight had been lifted, not by mercy, but by inevitability. As he stood there, the recorder clicked on by itself. No tape inside. Still, the reel spun, empty. A low hum filled the room, vibrating through his chest. The lattice unfolded across the walls, glowing infinite, more vivid than ever before. The word came, not as pressure this time, but as clarity. Return. The car outside revved its engine. Doors opened. Boots crunched on gravel. Miller whispered, "I can't go with them." The lattice brightened, lines weaving, shapes shifting. He felt himself pulled upward, though his feet remained on the ground. The room dissolved into geometry, light pouring through cracks in reality. For the first time, he didn't resist. The front door burst open. Voices shouted his name. But by then, the study was no longer a room. It was a horizon. He stood at its edge, uniform dissolving into light, body unmoored. Behind him, men with guns and orders rushed into emptiness. Ahead of him, the lattice opened wider, beckoning. Miller took a breath, steady as he had in every cockpit before takeoff. He stepped forward and vanished. Later, the report will be simple. Captain John Miller failed to comply with transfer orders. Residence searched. Subject missing. Presumed absent without leave. No mention of the glow. No mention of the hum. No mention of the man who had become the door. The silence machine filed its papers. The sky kept its secret. But somewhere between them, John Miller flew again.